Hi, I am Izzy Fenwick and I am very excited to be bringing you a new podcast series from the Aotearoa Circle called The Circle We Keep. So follow along while I talk to public and private leaders about New Zealand's natural capital and future prosperity for the country. Follow along, join, subscribe, send me a carrier pigeon with questions if you have any, and I look forward to seeing you there. Hi there, thanks for joining us today on The Circle We Keep. I've got a great conversation for you with Simon Limmer. He's the CEO of Indevin, but also a guardian of the Aotearoa Circle with me and co-chaired the NCR2 workstream, which you'll hear all about in a minute. So here's Simon. Thanks for joining us today, Simon, for this conversation.
Kia ora, Izzy. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. I know we talked a little bit about what we might talk about today, and this was not one of those things. So I'm already going a little bit off script, but I felt like I couldn't not talk about the role that you played in me eating red meat for the first time in about a decade. So let's share that story with our viewers before we get into some of the other things we kind of plan to cover off, because I think it's such a great example of the fluidity of things depending on certain scenarios. So yeah, I hadn't had red meat in a decade, and Silver Fern Farms was hosting an event at Parliament, and the only option was the red meat, and I was emceeing, and I got back to my seat and I'd just been served red meat and I hadn't eaten all day and I was starving, and I said to the person beside me, I don't eat red meat because emissions. And she was like, you know that the red meat is net zero, there are no, so your principles are void in this instant. And I ate the meat, and oh my God, it was so good that I think I got on stage and swore to a room full. I did. I think I said something like,
you would have been ejected from Parliament if that had been under the normal course of events, but it certainly left a lasting impression on the 200 people who were sitting in the Grand Hall at the Beehive. And you were our target audience, obviously, Izzy. We were trying to convert the principled meat eaters or non-meat eaters, and we managed to do so. So not only was it net carbon zero beef that you were able to get your head around, but secondly, it tasted pretty good, didn't it?
Oh my God, it tasted so good. Any impact that I had on the audience is nothing compared to the impact that was had on me.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is a really important sort of example of what is possible, and our New Zealand farming systems afforded the opportunity to actually change the narrative a little bit around how we farm and the way that we're producing meat, and be bringing these, I guess, multiple driving forces together around food and nutrition and farming, and also the environment and nature positive. It's been a pretty significant outcome for Silver Fern Farms to be able to take those products to market and tell the story as to how these products are farmed, with all of those sort of competing tensions being satisfied. We often talk about the economic return of responding to the market and our ability to extract a premium in market and be paid for the attributes, but the farmers feel quite a long way disconnected from the end user, and our job is to try and make those experiences real. That was a moment in time where there was a consumer who was potentially way outside of the target audience, who was able to sort of come into the fold, have that experience, feel good about it, and send the messaging back to farmers that what you're doing is good, we can reward you for that. And ultimately that connection with other consumers around the world just becomes more real for them. It becomes a reality. So it was a very important moment, Izzy. We need to do more of them. Keep eating that good New Zealand farmed red meat.
So we've talked a little bit about your protein, but your career has been pretty well-rounded meal, really. You had an entree of fruit, and then you had some protein, and now you're having an after-dinner wine. Are you just sort of hungry all the time, or you like working in food and fibre? What's
I've got a feeling this conversation might end quite quickly from here. The well-rounded eating your way around the around the farming system. Yes, I enjoy eating, Izzy, and sometimes it's good to mix your job. Business and pleasure
Absolutely.
do go together. But, New Zealand is such it's the world's best producer of quality products. We've got the most amazing farmers, and we combine that with the most incredible environment that we have, and the uniqueness of the products that we have with all of that care and attention and just the natural goodness going into the products is, makes it for it's such a good story for us to be able to take to the world with authenticity. So when we are measuring the way that we're making our products and then we're able to tell the story around how sustainable they are, aligned with how good they taste, it's a really, really privileged role to be able to go and tell that story around the world. And at the same time, I get to benefit from, you've got to have product knowledge and understand what your wine tastes like and your various different cuts of meat, and of course the wonderful thing which is zespri kiwi fruit, just an incredible story. So yes, I enjoy eating. Thanks, Izzy.
The onboarding process must be a real dream for each of those.
You've got to do your due diligence. It's really important. I've been doing it for decades.
So those are three, iconic Kiwi brands. And so some people might not know, but t'as vécu à Paris aussi?
Oui, bien. J'ai vécu à Paris une dizaine d'années, 10 years in France, a little bit more than 10 years. My children were both born in Paris. I ended up moving to France in the early 90s. That's where I learned how to eat, and I've been very, very good at it ever since. But yeah, I was fortunate enough to have that experience, like many New Zealanders, that overseas experience. I fell in love with France, I fell in love with the culture, I fell in love with the people, fell in love with the food. And yeah, from 1992 to 2008, I spent a big part of my career working for a French company, living in France for a big portion of that time, as well as other places around the world. And it taught me a huge amount just about, New Zealand's place in the world, my own, identity and how I felt about things. But probably more than anything, that when it was time to come home, that was also a pretty good choice. So coming home in 2008, two children who were 3 and 5 at the time, who needed this Kiwi upbringing, which we've all, loved. And, they needed to run barefoot on the beach. They needed to experience the New Zealand way of life. They needed to be able to go and catch snapper sustainably. They needed to have those experiences that I had valued so much. And, much as I loved France, it wasn't quite the same. So really important to get back home. And that was the start of my journey in the primary sector back here.
Nice. And you came home to the Bay of Plenty, which we're going to talk a little bit about because it's the region of the NCR squared work, which we're going to talk about, starting with what NCR squared actually even means. But the Bay of Plenty was personal to you too.
Yeah. So I grew up in the Waikato, but my family had one foot in the Bay of Plenty, so my whole life has been connected to that. For me, what is a very special part of the world. I think just the natural environment, the connection with the sea, the lifestyle that it affords was very important. And I had the opportunity to come and join Zespri, which of course is headquartered in the beautiful bay. And so from 2008, that has been the place that I've called home. My children have continued to grow up in that environment. I had 10 years in the kiwi fruit industry, felt a really strong connection to that community because it is so heavily concentrated in the Bay of Plenty. Everyone knows each other. New Zealand's superpower that we're all interconnected, related in many cases, but certainly we know each other, and there is that sense of interdependency, of responsibility to each other to maintain the quality of life that we have. So the Bay of Plenty really, really important for me. Children grew up in that environment, and I'm a kiwi fruit grower today, so I'm invested in the Bay, and feel a real sense of responsibility to maintaining that. So the NCR squared opportunity through the Aotearoa Circle came up. So NCR squared, natural capital, regional resilience, a little bit of a mouthful, but the regional resilience was the key to it. How do we preserve all that is good in that region? So a little bit of a pilot as to how we think about the regional response to climate change, to natural capital, but but at the same time recognising that all of New Zealand, or the whole world, in fact, is having to do this type of thinking, and the interdependency again between the Bay of Plenty and the rest of New Zealand is something which isn't lost on us, but it was a focus back into that region, and a real focus into not just the economic impacts on, for example, the kiwi fruit industry or the other primary sector producers, or the Port of Tauranga, the cultural richness of that region, the role of iwi to ensure that we're preserving all that is great about, the lifestyles that it affords us in the Bay of Plenty. So, it was about prosperity, well-being, lifestyle, in the most holistic sense of the word. So, great project to be involved in.
We're both guardians of the circle, and we usually sort of sit at that governance level, but when this project came up, your hand shot up so fast to be, pretty involved. What drove your interest in kind of being, in that leadership group and kind of a little bit more hands-on than sometimes we are as guardians?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that parochial view of the region, and I guess, my ambition to maintain the quality of life or to enhance the quality of life that's possible there, with a threat that's coming at us, which is, multifaceted, long-term in its nature, very hard for us to think about in a joined-up way. And I think that was the opportunity. So that region, my connection to it, but also a different way of thinking than what we had done at a more micro level at Zespri, or through the farming, even through the primary sector. All of those industries and those public bodies are doing their thinking, but they're kind of doing it in isolation through their own lens, kind of looking back at themselves. Whereas this opportunity to think in a more joined up way, think in a more holistic way, think longer term, and really sort of think about what we need to be doing that we're not doing, and how that sort of community focus might change things up.
I think that's a really important concept for us to dig into a little bit, because I think some people think about sustainability or nature or the environment, and they think about what their organisation could or should be doing, and how their organisation impacts nature, or how nature and the environment impacts their organisation. But that's relatively an okay way to think about it from like an emissions reduction perspective. You have X emissions, you reduce them, cool. When it comes to natural capital and nature, an individual organisation, has some control, but it's such a bigger beast than that. Yeah. And I guess, I think, hearing from you about those challenges between what you can control as an organisation, but actually what a region needs for natural capital to be in enough abundance that for a long-term positive outcomes for a region economically, as well as all the other benefits that we know we get from nature. But I think there is some tension there between, as an organisation, I can do X, but actually what natural capital or a region needs can be different.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex, multifaceted beast. And if you just think about the effects of the environmental changes that we're seeing, not just in air quality or air temperatures, but soil quality of water, of sea temperatures, of aquaculture, of horticulture, of farming, of right the way through, the impacts are multifaceted, and that's a real challenge, because you've got to be looking quite a long way down the runway as to what the long-term impacts are, what the short-term actions are that can be taken. How do you bring that cohort together and make it meaningful when you've got the competing tensions of economic and political and cultural, the public sector drivers, the political cycles they're faced with, the private sector drivers, the economic cycles that they're faced with, but really sort of raising up above all of that, almost banking all of the good work that goes there, but taking it to the next level where the sum of the parts is again much greater. A real challenge, and NCR Squared is still, I think in the early stages of that. But what they've managed to do is take a holistic view of it. The work that's been done through the Aotearoa Circle with the help of PwC, really important to build a framework around that. Now, what was interesting is that almost immediately the various interest groups are looking at that framework and sort of pointing to the areas that there may be dispute or risk. We shouldn't talk about that because it's going to impact X, Y, or Z, property prices or consumer confidence or banking systems or insurance. So, you've got to get beyond all of that and because they're real, and you've got to manage them. But ultimately, you've got to focus on the longer term impact, and it takes real work, and it's a changing mindset, and it's building trust in that community that we can work together and get better solutions than what we're doing individually.
My understanding is that report found, a number of things, but if we stay sort of focused on this one thing for a second, that if we do nothing from a regional resilience perspective around the natural capital that supports the economy down there, looking at I think, 350 million loss in the next sort of 30 years and a 33 billion loss in, I want to say, sort of 2090. Pretty terrifying. Where do those losses come from, and what does that mean to the business community down there? Society down there, job losses. Like, sort of where is that money coming from?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that those are numbers. They're big numbers and they're important numbers, but they're kind of just that. They're numbers. And they're a long way down the track, some of them. 2030, not so much, that's tomorrow. And that is a significant impact. The reality is that the impact is coming and it's going to be big and it's going to be economic. That's what gets people's attention. But it's also around lifestyle, and it's around cultural impacts, and it's around that sense of prosperity or well-being in the more holistic way. And the economic impacts, that was a big point of contention. Is it 350 million, or is it 1 billion, or is it 30 million? I'm really confident, having spent that time in Zespri, knowing how they think about the world, that the kiwi fruit industry will be well prepared, but it won't be the same. And so at an individual level, people need to understand what the impacts may be on their land. At a more organisational level, there will be mitigations and there will be opportunities that stem from this, and that's the way of thinking that's really, really important. But at the end of the day, those numbers are just that.
I so appreciate that, and it's a really good call out, because what's the difference between 350 and 355 and 360 or 300? They're a signal more than like a...
Yeah. And one thing's for sure is that they won't be right.
Yeah.
It'll be something else. I think what we are seeing, we talk a lot about it. It's all good until it's not. And understanding where those tipping points are coming. But a lot of it's gradual. If you just think about temperature change in the Bay of Plenty, for example, and the impact of productivity on kiwi fruit, it's something that we need to respond to. Kiwi fruit industry is incredible at its ability to adapt. It's a fantastic New Zealand story. And it's come through a number of crises in its past. And PSA is a really good example that, we lived through about 15 years back. And the ability for the community to work together to find solutions and put in place a number of different practices and tools and techniques and investments and what have you to make the cumulative effect resolve the problem and in fact come out so much stronger than it was going into that crisis. And so I have a huge degree of faith that we can do those things, but getting ahead of them, thinking through the consequences, making plans, putting actions in place today, even if we don't see a short-term return on it, that is the key to this sort of thinking. Strategic thinking at a very high level in the long term. And
I couldn't agree more about Zespri. And, there are lots of companies that were involved that we should also give lots of kudos to. But Zespri, looked that bull in the horns and said, we want to be involved. We're not scared to know the reality because we know what the reality is.
Yep.
Give us the information we need to adapt and be prepared. So I think they are a great example of you get the evidence you need to make really good decisions and you start making those decisions as early as you can.
Yeah.
But like you say, that is such a challenge between we know something's coming, in the future, but today I have a dumpster fire of stuff to get through. And I think, we're in, a not easy time for business. I know you might not have an answer, so to speak, and it might, be more of a recognising what attention this is, but how do we push through those immediate dumpster fire demands to try and look into the future, especially since what we've been talking about is, like you say, that kind of gradual decline, and it's kind of slowly and sort of into the future, and it's okay until it really isn't. And that can be harder to connect with than the big hits that come from like an extreme weather event where you then quickly recover. This is something else. So, how do you think about managing those immediate demands that are so true and the demands we know we're going to have to deal with in the future too?
And the context shifts, and there are periods of time where there is more imperative to shift than others, and that's driven by maybe a political environment, maybe regulatory threats, maybe public perception around certain activities, or the one that continues to hit us, the economic realities of when times are good, we're prepared to invest more in things that are longer term. I think one thing that is useful is the conversation around natural capital, how we think about capital in the broader sense. We've been really, really good for decades of thinking about economic capital. We think about in business our balance sheets and building the value of our assets. We've been very good about tangible assets. It's maybe more the concept of intangible assets. We've evolved a lot around human capital and the importance of people in the society and the communities that we serve as being something that we measure more proactively today than we probably did 10 or 20 years ago. And the concept of natural capital in terms of the environments that we're working in, how they serve us so well. And a really good example that I've learned more recently is, we have a unique proposition with some of our New Zealand wines, which are unique because of the environment that they're grown in. And, the New Zealand climate, the soils that we have, the locations that we have, allow us to provide a product which is highly differentiated and uniquely New Zealand because of our environment. Now, that's a capital, asset for us, right? Our ability to continue to do so. If that were to change, our business is economically impacted. So, making those direct links, thinking more proactively about how we manage and measure natural capital, I think then brings the conversation to a better level around the actions that we're taking today. How are we investing in natural capital as well? How are we preserving? How are we putting more back than we're taking out? So I think the conversations are evolving. It's quite a tough one. The intangible nature of what we're talking about makes it challenging, but the conversations are maturing.
I remember quite vividly having a conversation with Dad before he passed away about natural capital, and that he felt a little bit uncomfortable with that term.
If there's a better term, let's work on it. But for the moment,
it might come. But while we don't have an alternative to capitalism today, we use what we have with what we've got. So I know a lot of the circle's partners really do understand natural capital and its value to their businesses. How would you help someone who had just heard that concept kind of make sense of it? Because the other thing that I worry a little bit about is that some businesses think, that is a Simon problem because he works with nature, he works in agri, that's a very Simon issue. But, our whole economy from a systems level very reliant on nature, and not from a conservation or a scenery perspective, although for the tourism industry, sure.
Totally.
But, our economy sits on top of this natural capital no matter where you kind of sit. So how would you help someone that had never really heard of natural capital make sense of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it is certainly an acute challenge for the primary sector, but, New Zealand's distance from the market, our scale and all of these things, and the perception that the world has of us that needs to be backed up with authenticity, really, really important. And the leadership role that we can play globally also really, really, really important. So, the first thing I think at a firm level is, and we're getting better and better, it is sort of knowing where we stand. So, okay, what are we doing? And then kind of deciding what we stand for. So this is where we're at, but this is where we want to be. And most businesses today, I think, are doing that level of thinking and making investments to make improvements. And now some of that might be market-led, some of it might be regulatory, some of it might be their social license to operate, and some of it may just be businesses have decided this is who we are, this is how we are going to show up. So all of those things are good. But first of all, knowing where you are, knowing where you want to be, taking a long-term view, really, really important, because we know that, as we've said, it's all good until it's not. And so there's no point in it's too late. It's already late. It's too late if we get to that point. Long-term view, holding those concepts together through the various different cycles and the pressures that businesses go through, but making sure that they're, if we come back to the capital and the asset value piece, that, we use accounting mechanisms like depreciation to put money aside to reinvest in our assets. Maybe that's how we should be thinking about, the investments that we're making today and in the future. Practical tools, but ultimately it's also around leadership in terms of, setting the expectations, taking the stakeholders, taking the people, taking the shareholders, the customers, the community with them in terms of making sure the journey is well understood.
Going back to NCR Squared for a minute, was there anything during that process that surprised you in terms of the findings, or because this is something that you've had some experience in, it wasn't sort of that surprising? Was there anything that was surprising to you in the findings or process of that report?
I think two things became apparent to me. One is that there is, quite a strategic number of opportunities that arise from this, or a new framework of thinking over and above what had previously existed, a more joined up ecosystem of strategic thinking. And that's really aided by some of the more immediate applied opportunities that have been identified, and how those opportunities probably existed before, but they kind of sat in a little bit of isolation. But when you join them up with the public sector having a look in and going, well, actually, we could be doing this to accelerate, and then others from the private sector saying, well, yeah, we'd like to be involved in that as well. So there are some quite exciting things that have come out already where it's been identified, well, this is something that we can be doing, which actually, it's the counter of the negative economic impact, but it's, quite a significant opportunity. So that doesn't surprise me, but it really kind of gets my attention. And good things coming out of it. It's not an easy concept, and it hasn't been, it's not always plain sailing, having conversations which people are a little bit tired of, but having them in a new way with more specific sort of concrete outcomes as to, what are we going to do? What's the action we're going to take?
I think the other sort of great example of that work, was useful, even if it was challenging, and there were some uncomfortable parts for people sort of at the end while feeling like they needed to get their kind of ducks in a row, that other regions are asking, can we get this modelled for us too?
Yeah.
Because it is scary, it is hard. There will be ducks that need to be rowed after, but we need to know the reality sooner rather than later as well. I don't know if we've started looking at a second. No,
you're right. There have been, to my knowledge, sort of 3 or 4 other regions who have said, right, we want to go next. The value of a framework is the first thing. Okay, so we've established now a methodology as to how we step through this. We've learned some lessons along the way, which means that we'll adapt. And we've looked at it on a regional basis through one lens, but we need another lens to look through as well as the consequential impact of, if this happens in the Bay of Plenty, I think about Northland from a kiwi fruit production perspective versus Bay of Plenty, and I think about Bay of Plenty versus Marlborough as a wine producing. What are the consequential impacts? Where to next if the climate in the Bay of Plenty is going to move to this point? What does that mean for? We've talked about the risk in that region. What is the opportunity in another, which is emerging? But until we have that joined up view, we can't look through both of those lenses. So that, for me, is going to sort of doubly amplify or triply amplify the benefit of the thinking.
So cool. I was up in India in March at a fellowship. You hear about that? And in a number of the sessions that we had up there, representatives from other countries, actually sort of in general, the experts were talking a lot about the benefits of public-private partnerships as tools for, overcoming massive challenges.
Yeah.
And, you can see why that is an obvious good, approach. But what I was really amazed by was that there was a lot of, we need more of these, but we actually don't have very many good examples kind of globally. I remember kind of putting my hand up and being like, we've got one in New Zealand, it works like this. And I had a bit of an aha moment around how, we've got no excuse really in New Zealand not to be super collaborative. We're this, beautiful little rock in the bottom of the southern hemisphere where, it's not even 2 degrees of separation. So doing collaborative work like NCR Squared was, we can literally do that, and we should be doing that. Yeah. Did you see that sort of connectiveness come through in that work?
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's our superpower, right? We're small enough that we know each other, and there's a high degree of trust. But we're big enough that we can actually make some quite substantial differences, and we are. It's in our DNA to innovate. And that innovation will have global implications. So absolutely, and I've been fortunate probably to have lived through 2 or 3 of those quite applied experiences. AgriZero is another one that I'm involved in terms of public-private pan-industry approach to an acute problem around methane emissions, ruminant animals, and so these things are possible, and they're possible at a scale which is meaningful, and they're possible, in terms of the global implications that they can have. So, absolutely, it's a new way of thinking. It requires coordination. Of course, it's easier for us just to stick in our swim lanes and do what we do and use our own organisational hierarchies to get things done. And the reality is that we've got, time constraints, we've got resource constraints, we've got agenda constraints, we've got egos that, that can get in the way of these. But, the more that we can lean into it, the more that we can just identify what it is that's different around this sort of cohort versus, the rest. Thinking in a bipartisan, long-term way, really, really important as well. Let's get the politics out of it. Let's try and get the economics out of it. Let's get on with what's really strategic for us, because it's an opportunity.
I think, it requires a certain, view and leadership style to be comfortable leaning into that. And one of the things you've referenced quite a bit is, building the trust needed to do those things. Because I think there are, some, organisations or sectors or industries that might feel like it's a bit of a threat to be working with competitors in a, collaborative way like this.
Yeah.
What would you be saying to encourage more people to see the benefit in looking at the systemic way that we can work together for the good of New Zealand, our economy, all of the above, versus, again, sort of fighting that urge to just stay in your lane, focused on your own organisation?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing, if I look through a sort of a more business lens, New Zealand is too small in most cases for us to be fighting inwardly, and we do it a lot. We do it, in sectors I've been involved in. The economic challenge or opportunity for us is out on the global world as exporters, and I'm talking specifically about the primary sector, but I think it holds, we get into a competitive mindset, but we lose sight of the big prize. So I think that's the first thing. There is an opportunity there for us to do better, and there are really good examples of how we've built trust and then collectively show our face to the world in a really, really positive way. The second thing I'd say is there are certain things that people should not be seeking competitive advantage. Health and safety is a really good example. That is where we've got a vested interest, our social licence, to ensure that we are sharing best practice. The environment, climate change, natural capital is another one. There's just no doubt. We might be taking products to market, such as Silver Fern Farms has, that are taking claims and attributes, which I think are very, very positive. But at the end of the day, our response to this needs to be collective. And again, from a purely New Zealand Inc. perspective, that will differentiate us on the world's stage. But some of this technology, it's a global issue.
I know I'm very biased in being a big fan of the Aotearoa Circle. How do you think about the opportunities that the Aotearoa Circle creates?
Yeah, well, I think, again, that public-private relationship, at a personal level, I feel, quite deeply connected to the policymakers in Wellington, and I know the way that they think, and I also, have a strong sense of their intent, which is really positive. A lot of the time we sit back, we're not engaging. It's quite hard to sometimes bridge between particularly industry and government, and we tend to imagine. And our imaginations kind of take us off into a slightly different direction, that we're fighting against each other rather than sort of. So that's a really, really positive forum in terms of having that public-private relationship, and the number of businesses involved is, it's a very, very big group of New Zealand businesses. So that's fantastic. I think it also takes the conversation to a level that's really hard to have at the individual level. You might get it at a sectorial level or an industry body level or what have you, but taking it to that next level.
I think about some of the big goals that the Circle has in shifting mindsets even, and I think that there's some assumptions out there that nature is a conservation issue, or nature is a scenic issue, and what do you think is the mindset shift needed for more people to understand the real, the real role that nature plays in New Zealand?
We've probably touched on a lot of it. We probably suffer from the fact that we have, through our isolation and our size, so many natural advantages, where New Zealand, when you look out to the rest of the world, you go, thank God we're here. And so that takes a little bit of the imperative away in terms of we're pretty good, we're clean and we're green. And we know that it's at a superficial level, we know that we have work to do. I'd probably bring it back though to just a systemic way of thinking around the importance of the environment, thinking about the impact that climate change or environmental change, the consequence of that, and being prepared to get ahead of that, and thinking long term, because we all think short term. It's easy, and those are the imperatives coming at us. But this one we just need to understand and be thinking longer term.
I think you hit the nail on the head as well. With you look out the window and so grateful to live somewhere so beautiful. Where's point to the problem? It's quite hard to see. And I had a conversation recently talking to someone about, the decline in New Zealand's natural capital. And they were shocked that there was a decline in New Zealand's natural capital because, point to it. Nature's looking good. And, we look at some other places that really don't look like New Zealand does. So I do think that's a real challenge from, what your eyes are telling you versus what the science is telling you, and how do you?
It's complicated.
It's complicated.
It's massively complicated, and we also, we suffer from a sense of inertia because what can I do that's going to make a difference? So there's a collective response that needs to happen, and it's hard to know what to do. There is so much conversation, debate, science, policy, and you've got to break it down to simple concepts like, I want to be giving back more than I'm taking. I want to put more back in than what I'm taking out. And those sort of concepts, I think, serve us really, really well, because then you can sort of go, oh, well, if this is what I need to extract what I need, this is what I need to be doing to make sure that tomorrow it's better than what it was yesterday.
But yeah, I do often think about the challenge of what we see with our eyes versus what we know in the research, and how hard that must be for people to feel the real sense of urgency to act And like you say, we'll be fine until we're not.
Yeah, and then we manage to sort of tie ourselves in knots around debates, urban, rural kind of conversations, farming versus other industries. Not really that helpful, and in fact, a lot of what we are doing is good, and it is quite innovative, and it is quite world leading. We need to be celebrating that and then setting the expectation, okay, now what next? The incremental change that we have to make, trying to get those conversations back into the centre of what we're talking about in a balanced way rather than, polarised views. But not easy. We're pretty good at that in New Zealand. And the rest of the world sort of looks at us and go, what is going on there? With very conflicting kind of conversations.
If you were going to tell, someone a good first step, or even, what kind of simple research or science or thinking to kind of get their head around to understand a little bit more of the reality. Because I think you and I sit in this quite often, and I remember being surprised with someone being like, oh, is there something wrong with our nature decline and our water quality is an issue? Like, what? Someone should tell someone about that. But again, you don't want to point them to lots of like really heavy data or sort of technical research, but what advice would you give to someone who wants to develop a deeper understanding of the realities that we're at from a positive perspective too, like the opportunities that we have to maintain and restore what makes us such a rich and beautiful country? Where would you send them?
For me, the key is getting an understanding as to where you stand. Again, okay, you've got to measure what's going on in your own backyard at a micro level. At a macro level, I think is more your question as to what are the sum of the parts and how are we tracking. But knowing where you're at then allows you to kind of say, well, these are the material issues, and you can't go after them all. So once you know what your top 3 material issues are, you can start to focus on those and then work your way down the list as to, this is where I stand, this is what I stand for, and what I want, where I want to be. And here are some points along the way that I can sort of check in, make sure that I'm ticking off milestones and be moving in the right direction, because, it doesn't happen overnight. But when it does happen, it will happen quickly, but it's been happening slowly. So, how do we take steps and break it down into bite-sized chunks that people can deal with?
Someone described it to me recently, that kind of nature decline versus, climate change is our natural capital decline or nature degradation is a little bit like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Like every little paper cut doesn't really seem too bad until you are bleeding to death, and then everything's sort of a bit trickier, versus some of those big weather events that just sort of really floor you. How do we encourage the recognition that actually those paper cuts are really building up, or find some urgency in what can feel like I'll worry about that next year or the year after, or maybe the next person in this role will take that bull by the horns, but for right now it's not really a material issue.
It sort of comes at us at 2 speeds, doesn't it? We are seeing more events, catastrophic events that we know are more regular than what we used to see. Each time that happens is a reminder, and we're really good at circling the wagons and responding and lifting everyone back up. What I have seen in the farming sector is that there are responses to that. People are adapting the way that they're doing things, saying, well, that happened last time, I'm not going to let that happen next time. But it's quite high-level responses to the way that they're organising themselves and their infrastructure and their systems. The other speed is the incremental change, and that's slow and steady, and we don't know until we wake up one day and we go, what happened? If you think about productivity and climate change or temperature change, and I think about grape growing or kiwi fruit growing or something, they'll grow pretty successfully in a range of climates. We might see some productivity shifts. Some of them might be quite favourable, but then we get beyond some of those limits, and that is an existential shift, and whereby, you can no longer actually do it in a viable way that you used to. And so it's the death by 1,000 paper cuts that creeps up on us. And I think, again, it's about looking at the evidence as to how things are shifting, looking at the projections as to how things are going to continue to shift, and NCR2 did this, looking at the points whereby, okay, we've now got there's a survival issue of however we determine it at that point in time. Stepping back to here, getting the belief in that, getting the understanding in that, getting the trust that we can actually make a change, I think is key.
Last little sort of bit on NCR squared. It's a lot of pages. If you were going to, try and shortcut someone that didn't have a chance to read through those pages, I, of course, read every word.
Of course you did.
Of course I did. Let's say I didn't. How would you kind of get me on an understanding of what NCR squared found?
I mean, I think you touched on it before. I think we all understand, the impacts of climate change and what is happening. Well, we have a sense of what that means. When you put it in economic terms, as the report has attempted to do, that gets your attention because those are big numbers. How you then, and I defy anyone to turn that into a relevant impact on themselves or their companies individually. Potentially Zespri might, but how you think about how you relativise those numbers for yourself, not easy, but you can get a sense of what's going on. And if you think about some of the specific, warming of seawater and the impact on aquaculture or coastal resilience around what we're seeing by way of erosion and, with storm surges and what have you, or what you see with the climate impact on kiwifruit. Those are quite specific things that you can relate to. You can say, okay, well, I believe that that's happening. And for each of those, we're now starting to see responses, mitigations, research into varieties which are going to, adapt differently to different temperatures, the response to coastal erosion around how the community is coming together and putting in place mitigations, or, an adaptation of the marine aquaculture industry and the opportunities that affords and the way that they're having to adapt as well. That brings it to a level where you can sort of start to specifically get your head around what the impact is and what some of the responses might be. I think for me, that's how my mind works.
So was the NCR squared based on some scenarios? Was it essentially kind of a scenario of certain warmings, but where we've done, some scenario mapping in the past from the circle, it's been very industry focused. So we did scenarios for seafood, for example. Was the foundation of NCR squared some scenarios, but for a region?
Yeah. So first of all, we looked at the region holistically, and we looked at industry, we looked at lifestyle, we looked at culture, we looked at recreational fishing and the gathering of seafood and the cultural implications of all of that. So a sort of a holistic view as to what would change, what will change, how are our lives going to change, not just economically, but how will we live differently in the future. So that was really probably a slightly different lens, and then just the joined up nature of the various different environmental impacts. If temperature does this, then water will do this, rainfall may do this, we may see more rain, we may see more drought, we're going to see more sea surges, we're going to see more temperature shift in oceans, and the interdependencies of all of those, and then figuring out again the impact. And then looking through a community lens as to, okay, this is going to impact industry, this is going to impact the port, this is going to impact the regional government, this is going to impact the insurance companies, having a joined up view of all of that, then kind of gives you a big picture you can stand back from. Okay, well, what if, who needs to be impacted in that what if conversation? So a more holistic view of the world with a very long term. And
so sort of putting in certain interventions in that holistic process to change outcomes. But was it essentially kind of focused around warming?
Not just warming, more, biodiversity in the broader sense. I think, what can we expect if we're tramping in the forests and in the region? What is the wildlife going to be impacted? What if you're a hunter? What does it all mean? What it didn't look to do was fix the problem. It looked at, okay, what are the adaptations and mitigations that this is the likely direction of travel we're going to have to adapt and mitigate. I think that naturally takes you back to a conversation. Okay, what do we do now to try and slow the problem?
Because of course I have read every word.
Yes.
But I know it was regarded as pretty significantly different to some of the other climate scenario work that we have done. So I guess my understanding now, even though, of course, I read every word, is that it was really taking it to an even higher level of, we're not just looking at what would happen to the seafood industry under certain, differing conditions, environmental conditions. It's what would happen to a region. Because New Zealand's so small and so interconnected, there is no industry really that isn't affected by a region or vice versa. Yeah. So it makes good sense to do it that way. What a good idea you had to do that.
Your idea, I think.
Yeah. NCR squared, whole nother level really, not just industry focused, whole region. So I understand that even the sort of governance was a bit different, not a leadership group, but a champions group.
Yeah, so in fact, I think, the ambition of a project of that size needed the centralised thinking that came out of the Aotearoa circle with the expertise of the likes of PwC. 3 co-chairs, so 2 very talented individuals, and Fiona McTavish, who's the Chief Executive of the Regional Council, and Pa McGowan, who represented the local iwi. Just fantastic in terms of the complementary perspectives and thinking, but the way that able to weave the thinking together and take it to the next level. So I was the third one.
Also very talented, and
I did my best. I tried to uphold my end of the bargain as well. But quite a unique opportunity for me. You're typically in much more sort of business-like settings, working with regional council with that really beautiful iwi perspective of things, which actually kept us at a level which was pretty impressive. Pa's fantastic. But beyond that, that was a relatively tight group with the circle, with the co-chairs and with PwC driving it, and that was sort of the first 6 months of the project sat around that, and then we expanded it out through the champions group. So what were known as the champions, we needed the local community at a much broader a breadth of coverage to pick it up. And a lot of these people are called into this sort of initiative, quite regularly. So you've got to be pretty compelling quite quickly, otherwise you'll lose the room. And you've got to build that level of understanding and trust and energy to move it forward. Really fortunate through the connections that we got, incredible group of champions together. And today, the energy and the momentum sits with that group, and that's that's kind of amplifying the messaging, the leadership, the buy-in to what needs to become quite a big ecosystem. It's complicated, and you need a lot of empathy, and you need to put your self-interest to one side, because ultimately your self-interest will be served, but you've got to believe that that's going to be the case. So really good. The champions have now picked up the mantle on this, and the next stage is happening. The circle is sort of stepping back a little bit. It's primed the engine, and now the machine's running, and we just want to see it continue to gain momentum, and then we'll look at whether we can extend it out into the other regions as well. But the framework is, I think, incredibly valuable.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Simon, and for your wisdom.
Don't know about that, Izzy, but it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. So thank you again, Simon, for joining us today, and thank you for watching along. If you enjoyed this conversation, there are other conversations within the series that I encourage you to watch. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, send them our way. But in the meantime, subscribe, follow along, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.